The moment you open your eyes in the morning, you are not truly beginning from zero. What wakes up first is yesterday's mood, the memory of the days before it, and the version of yourself you have rehearsed so many times that it now feels automatic. You call it a new day, but for most people, it is only the past starting up again. That is why life can feel strangely repetitive even when the calendar keeps moving. You think you are making choices, but often you are only replaying a script your nervous system already knows by heart. The same worry, the same doubt, the same inner argument, the same emotional weather. And then, eventually, the same kind of life. Most people believe destiny is something that happens to them. But more often, thought is what keeps carrying them toward the same old outcome. Thought is not just background noise. It is the input code of the subconscious. It triggers chemistry. Chemistry creates feeling. Feeling reinforces thinking, and before long, the body has made the decision before the conscious mind even notices. That is why change rarely begins with force. It begins with awareness. The moment you realize that the old self is not fate, but repetition, another possibility opens. You can choose a different thought. You can feel a different future. You can begin teaching the body a new emotional signature. When trust begins replacing control, when gratitude softens lack, when awareness becomes stronger than fear, the brain starts writing a different internal setting. Thought is the language of destiny. The future does not begin when it finally arrives. It begins when it is first allowed to speak through you. And when you sit still long enough to feel the version of yourself that has not yet fully appeared, you stop being a copy of memory and begin becoming a transmitter of the future. Destiny does not need to be chased. It needs to be matched. This is Momentum Arc, a space for inner exploration and spiritual growth. Your likes, comments, subscriptions, and super thanks do more than support this work. They may become the turning point for another soul. Let's keep sending these seeds of abundance farther and deeper, together. Dr. Joe Dispenza is a global authority on transformation. He earned that title by achieving what medicine deemed impossible. After a catastrophic accident shattered 6 of his vertebrae during a triathlon, he was told he would never walk again without major surgery, an operation that risked permanent impairment. He refused the surgery. Instead, he retreated into his mind, spending hours each day in a state of deep focus, mentally reconstructing his spine, bone by bone, with such precision that he was effectively rewriting his own biological blueprint. He didn't just think about walking. He signaled new genes by rehearsing the emotion of being healed before there was any physical proof. He proved that the brain does not know the difference between a real-life experience and one created through vivid mental rehearsal with elevated emotion. By the time he stood up and walked 9 weeks later, he had already walked 1,000 times in his mind. Dispenza's core message is that the self is not fixed by environment, genetics, or history. If thought and feeling change deeply enough, the brain can be reorganized, the body can be retrained, and the future can begin to lead the present. This is the central challenge of his book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. Most people are not simply living, they are repeating. They wake up as the same emotional identity and call that continuity a personality, when in reality it is a biological habit. He describes a loop that is both psychological and biological. A thought produces a chemical reaction, which creates a feeling. The feeling then makes the same thought easier to think again. Over time, the body becomes so familiar with certain emotional states that it begins craving them, even painful ones like anxiety, scarcity, or guilt. Eventually, this familiarity is mistaken for identity. This is why people feel trapped. The old self is defended by a body trained to prefer the known past over an unknown future. To break that loop is to go beyond the habitual self. The shift begins when attention turns inward. When you stop letting the external world dictate your state and start noticing the state itself, the repetition begins to lose its power. Neuroscience gives this possibility a biological foundation. The brain is plastic. It is not a finished object. It is a living system, constantly shaped by attention, repetition, and emotional charge. Every thought is like a small instruction. Hold a thought long enough, and the brain starts strengthening the pathways that support it. Repeat it often enough, and the route becomes easier to travel. Over time, what was once a passing thought turns into a preferred road. Then it becomes a habit, then a temperament, then a life. You can imagine it as a path through a forest. Walk it once and almost nothing changes. Walk it every day and the grass gives way. Keep going and the path becomes obvious enough that you stop noticing you are choosing it at all. That is why people can change jobs, move cities, end relationships, or set new goals, and still end up living versions of the same story. The environment shifts, but the internal circuitry stays familiar. They keep walking the same mental road and wonder why the scenery keeps leading back to the same emotional place. But the very plasticity that makes repetition powerful is also what makes transformation possible. Once attention begins moving in a different direction, toward gratitude instead of lack, openness instead of defense, curiosity instead of dread, the brain begins receiving new instructions. The old routes do not vanish at once, but they are no longer the only ones available. This is why thought matters so much. Not because positive thinking is magic, but because repeated thought becomes architecture. It shapes what the brain expects, what the body rehearses, and what kind of future starts feeling believable. Thought alone, however, is not enough. The body does not believe a future because the mind describes it beautifully. It believes a future when emotion begins making that future feel real. Dispenza returns to this again and again. Clear intention and elevated emotion must meet. Intention gives direction. Emotion gives charge. One draws the outline, the other fills it with life. This is why a thought carried by gratitude, love, trust, or awe reaches much deeper than a thought left dry and abstract. The brain pays attention to emotional intensity. What is felt strongly is marked as important. What is merely described often stays on the surface. In his language, elevated emotion becomes the language of the quantum field. Whether or not one embraces every metaphysical implication, the practical principle remains powerful. When the body begins feeling the future before external proof appears, the whole system starts reorganizing around a new possibility. This is not fantasy. It is rehearsal. If the old body has been memorizing the chemistry of fear, then the future self has to be memorized differently. The person you are becoming cannot be built only in theory. The body has to start recognizing that version emotionally. It has to know what freedom feels like before the bank balance proves it. It has to know what safety feels like before the world fully reflects it back. That is why changing destiny is not just a matter of better thoughts. It is a matter of emotional alignment. The future begins landing in the present the moment the body stops insisting on the chemistry of the past. Dispenza often draws on quantum language to describe what opens up when the observer changes. Reality, in this view, is not a single fixed track, but a field of potential outcomes. The self who keeps observing through the old lens keeps calling forth familiar versions of life. The self who begins observing from a new state starts selecting differently. The key idea is not that consciousness controls the universe in some theatrical way. It is that inner state influences what you notice, what you sustain, what you embody, and therefore, what kind of reality you can cooperate with. When fear is the dominant state, the future narrows. When trust and coherence become stable, life starts looking less closed. Possibility becomes more available, not because the world suddenly turns magical, but because the observer is no longer filtering everything through the same constricted pattern. This reverses a common misunderstanding. Most people think they must wait for the environment to improve before they can feel free, grateful, or expansive. Dispenza turns that sequence around. Become inwardly coherent first, and the outer world begins responding differently. Become the future emotionally, and the present starts organizing itself around that signal. This is not passive. It demands discipline. It asks for repeated inner alignment before proof. It asks for a willingness to live from a state that the old self cannot yet justify. But that is exactly why it matters. The future does not fully open to the person still asking the past for permission. Insight only matters if it enters practice. Otherwise, it remains another beautiful idea that never changes the chemistry of an actual life. A simple beginning is awareness and separation. Sit quietly for a few minutes and notice the thoughts that return most often. Observe what they do inside the body. Where do they tighten you? What feeling do they call up? Then say, as clearly as you can, "This is the past speaking. This is not the whole of who I am now." Even that small separation begins creating freedom. A second practice is future rehearsal. Close your eyes and feel the version of yourself you are moving toward. Not as a fantasy image, but as a lived condition. How does that self breathe? How does that self feel in the chest, the face, the spine? Let the body memorize the future instead of only remembering the past. A third practice is interruption. Several times a day, ask, "Is my energy coming from fear or from love? Is this choice coming from memory or from the future?" These questions break the spell of automatic living. They pull you out of emotional autopilot and return you to authorship. And then there is the physical side of it. When old emotion rises, do not immediately perform it. Let the body sit. Bring attention back to the breath. Place awareness in the heart area. Slow the system enough that a different response has room to appear. This is not suppression. It is rewiring. Day after day, these practices teach the body a new pattern. The soul begins to breathe differently inside the life it inhabits. Thought becomes less like reaction and more like creation. Change is never entirely private. Every time you choose a higher thought, a steadier emotion, a more coherent inner state, something around you shifts as well. Your life is not an isolated line. It is part of a field. This is why transformation can feel contagious. When one person begins living from a clearer frequency, others feel it. Sometimes they resist it. Sometimes they are quietly invited by it. Either way, consciousness is never operating in isolation. Dispenza's deeper message is that as inner state rises, the larger field changes too. Science and spirituality stop appearing as enemies and start sounding more like two languages describing different levels of the same event. The self becoming more coherent, and life responding accordingly. At that point, destiny is no longer a script handed down by biology, history, or fate. It becomes something more participatory, something shaped by repeated awareness, emotional alignment, and the quality of thought you return to each day. You are not merely being carried by your mind. You are teaching it what world to build. Every morning still arrives quietly. The room may look the same. The world may seem unchanged. But hidden inside that ordinary moment is an opening. You can wake up as yesterday again, or you can let a different thought become the first signal of a different life. Set the old script down. Let the future begin speaking through you. Let science and spirit meet inside your own nervous system. Let thought wake up and lead you toward the self that has already been waiting ahead of you. And from there, let destiny turn.